I think it's good morning in Norway to our next presenter, Camilla Haugland Fischer.
Yes.
And I should say this,
you.
I think it is good morning. Is that correct?
It is good morning.
Yes.
For the first time in a very long time, I'm up before my baby.
Okay. Because it wasn't mentioned, but earlier today when we had Paul O'Neill from the United Kingdom, it was 2:30 a.m. their time, so he was very keen. So I think it's a bit later in the morning now. But Camilla has been a senior policy advisor at the Norwegian Ministry of Defence. She's worked in the strategic personnel and competence policy sections of the Norwegian Ministry of Defence, and she's responsible for developing comprehensive policy for the Norwegian Armed Forces with regards to manning and composition of competence in the force structure. And as we heard earlier this morning, earlier today with Paul O'Neill, the Norwegian Armed Forces are undertaking some very important initiatives. So thank you very much for presenting to us today. So I hope you can see us all, and it's over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I will put up my slides so that we can begin. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to participate and share Norwegian's perspective with you today. So as was already said, I'm with you today to share the Norwegian Ministries of Defence perspective on personnel challenges that we currently face in the Norwegian defence sector, and to go into detail on some of the measures that we are now taking within recruitment and retention. So unfortunately, the time difference has prevented me from hearing all the previous speakers, though I heard the last part of the previous presentation, and there are many things that sound familiar. And then I know that my colleague Eric from the Norwegian Embassy in Australia is in the room and have been taking notes that I hope that he will share with me later today. So personnel is the most critical input factor of operational readiness. And without personnel, plans are just paper and shining new material will gather dust in a storage somewhere. This is one of the underlying messages of the Norwegian long-term plan for defense for the period 2025 to 2036. And it's a historically ambitious plan that was passed unanimously by the Norwegian Parliament last year. And it clearly states that the success of the plan is contingent on whether the Norwegian Armed Forces reaches its goals to attract the necessary personnel with the right competence. And this is, of course, easier said than done. A previous Minister of Education, Ola Borten Moe, he memorably said about Norway in an interview a couple of years ago that this country will run out of people long before we run out of money. And this, I think, is a good summary of the challenges that we face. International and national factors shape the development and operational context of the Norwegian Armed Forces. The long-term plan for defense is Norway's response to an increasingly unstable, dangerous, and competitive security situation. However, the plan also acknowledges that the current national demographic and social trends could limit the opportunity space to reach important personnel and competence goals in the defense sector. Because these trends, they shape access to personnel and competence in society in general and in the armed forces in particular. And Norway, as you know, it's a big country with a small population. And to give you some numbers, the demographic predictions for Norway see a population increase from 5.5 million in 2024 to 6 million in 2040, while the number of deaths will overtake the number of births around 2045. And that's only 20 years from now. And from then on, the population growth will be mainly driven by immigration. The number of immigrants relative to the Norwegian-born population will increase from 17% in 2024 to 22% by 2050. And by 2050, the number of 80-year-olds will double and the number of 90-year-olds will triple. And at the same time, centralization and urbanization trends continue and intensify, and the education level continues to rise, and women are overrepresented among the highly educated. And I ask you to keep these numbers in mind as I come back to them later in my presentation. The deteriorating security situation requires major investments to increase military capacity and volume and improve situational awareness and military posture in our immediate surroundings. The primary objective of Norway's defense effort is to prevent and deter aggression in continuous and close collaboration with allies. And if deterrence should fail, the long-term plan proposes a number of measures in order to reduce vulnerabilities and increase the combat power, availability, and endurance of the armed forces. The defense pledge includes an increase of 600 billion Norwegian kroners in defense spending between 2025 and 2036 to a total of 1,635 billion Norwegian kroners over 12 years. And as you can see on this slide, there are four major efforts that are prioritized. And these are increased capabilities for situational awareness, a new maritime surface fleet, strengthening air defense capabilities, and increased capacity and volume in the Army and in the Home Guard. The strengthening of the armed forces require a lot more personnel and new skill sets, which I will elaborate on in the next slides. And the defense pledge, it puts Norway well above the NATO target of 2% of GDP allocated to defense spending. And current estimates show that Norway will be using 3.3% of its GDP in 2025, which includes Norway's military support to Ukraine. And in the run-up to the NATO summit this week, the Norwegian government announced its commitment to allocating 5% of GDP to defense-related expenditures. So, to succeed in building stronger defense capabilities, significant measures must also be taken in areas that support this effort, like infrastructure and personnel and competence. The main efforts to boost these impact factors are, as you can see in the slide, a volume increase of the Norwegian Armed Forces by several thousand personnel, a strengthening of the Armed Forces educational institutions, innovative measures to recruit and retain personnel, better utilization of the conscript system, and expanded use of reservists. And some of these measures are new, while most measures already exist today but needs upscaling. And some measures require the ministry to carry out policy or demands political action. However, most measures fall under the responsibility of the Chief of Defence of the Norwegian Armed Forces. And this is due to the governing model of the Norwegian defence sector. And I will say a few words about upscaling before we move on to the measures. So a part of the effort to strengthen the prerequisite factors for defense towards 2036 is to achieve an ambitious personnel growth. Today, the wartime structure consists of approximately 70,000 personnel. And there are, of these, there are around 20,000 regulars and 50,000 conscripts and reserves. Towards 2036, the government will strengthen the Norwegian wartime structure with 4,600 more conscripts, 13,700 reservists, and 4,600 employees. That's 4,600 employees that are both military and civilian. In addition to the increased recruitment, efforts will be made to address turnover rates and implement new measures to retain personnel and re-recruit earlier regulars. So looking at this slide, I ask you to remember my previous comments about the demographic and social developments in Norway. The upscaling of the Norwegian armed forces will take place at the same time as scarcity of labor and competence in Norwegian society in general increase, and other critical sectors like health also face a growing need for more personnel and competence due to an aging population and technological shifts. So how then are we going to facilitate growth? In order to meet the Norwegian Armed Forces' demand for personnel and competence in the next decade, a holistic approach is necessary. A holistic approach emphasizes the totality of the measures and not just one or just a few of them. However, even though all of these measures are critical, some measures must be given priority in the first phase of the plan. The first thing that has to be done is to substantially increase and strengthen the armed forces' educational capacity, which will be doubled by 2036 compared to the capacity in 2023. And the reason this has to be implemented immediately is, of course, that it takes a long time to develop new officers. We often say that it takes minimum 15 years to get a lieutenant colonel. Boosting the educational system on this scale requires infrastructure and instructors, among other things. Temporary measures can be put in place for infrastructure, while the current scarcity of instructors can imply a temporary dip in operational readiness, as instructors have to be reassigned from their operational units. We are also making a number of changes to the personnel policy framework, such as compensation, remuneration, and incentives, changes to the retirement age, and other changes to personnel schemes. And many of our employees also have a very high workload, and therefore we also plan for most of the fleet to operate with double crew systems so that the crews can work on rotation. We are also investing in more simulators, so that employees can be less away from home while on training, as we see that work-life balance is becoming increasingly important to younger employees, and this is of course important to improve retention. So better use of the total personnel resources also includes several competency measures. This includes the increased use of civilian personnel and competence in functions that don't strictly need to be manned by military personnel, like HR and legal, and a competence strategy for technological competence that will support the introduction of new capabilities in the long-term plan. And the personnel growth towards 2036 is largely based on increased staffing through conscription. And I will go more into detail on conscription next. Conscription is the main source of recruitment in the Norwegian Armed Forces. Mandatory service includes both peacetime and wartime service, though peacetime service is limited to 19 months duration in total for all citizens between 19 and 44 years of age, or 55 if the person has been employed by the armed forces for more than 1 year. The figure that you see on the left of this slide attempts to depict the national conscription system through 4 stages in peacetime. These are selection, basic training, first-time service, and reservist service. The selection part 1, it consists of an online questionnaire where every person in the cohort, that is approximately 60,000 persons each year, must answer questions assessing motivation, education, languages, social profile, physical and mental health, and so on. Answering the questionnaire is mandatory, and there is, on average, a 96% response rate. Approximately 25,000 persons then take part in the second round of selection. And selection part 2 consists of physical and aptitude tests taking place over the course of 1 day. and there are established minimum requirements to both physical and mental performance in order to serve. The persons who are found to be fit to serve are called for military service. Basic training consists of a 7 to 8 weeks long course in basic military skills, followed by compulsory service in a unit. We refer to the compulsory service as first-time service, and approximately 12 to 15% of the yearly cohort complete this part of the conscription service, and that is roughly around 11,000 persons. The first-time service can then last from 6 to 18 months. So after their first-time service, soldiers are transferred to the reserves, either to the Home Guard, which needs approximately 10% refill yearly, or to one of the other services in the armed forces. Typical reservist service consists of yearly refresher training, courses and information days within the limits established by law. And what you don't see on this slide is the civilian defense part of conscription. Because in addition to the armed forces, Norway has a civilian defense organization that is organized under the Ministry of Justice, which is included in the conscription system. Currently, civilian defense fills up their structure by a transfer of conscripts from the armed forces, mainly based on selection part 1 or part 2. In times of war, all citizens between 18 and 55 years that are capable of service may be called upon as reinforcement. The combination of a conscription scheme that until recently was adapted to low readiness with 20 years of continuous deployment to international operations and the introduction of more advanced weapon systems has over time led to the replacement of conscripts with permanent employees in several units. Now we are transitioning back to the use of conscripts and reserves that were to how it was in the 80s or 90s. In recent years, the Norwegian Armed Forces have started to adapt the framework for conscription through 4 strategic measures. The first is moving basic training programs out of the operational units and into separate basic training schools. The second is to introduce a mixed contingent of conscripts and regulars in operational units so that they maintain continuity and operational integrity. And thirdly, the armed forces have differentiated the duration of the first-time service. Normally, it's now between 12 and 16 months. And finally, when the conscripts are being transferred to the reserves, they should continue training regularly and periodically. Through these strategic moves, conscription as a manning concept has become more relevant. With 15 to 16 months of initial service, the conscripts can now fill positions with higher competency requirements. And as you can see to the left of this slide, the Army has come a long way in implementing longer service for conscripts, while the Navy and the Air Force are further behind. To the right, you can see a classification matrix that looks at a selection of roles and functions along 2 dimensions, complexity and volume. The plan is to use the conscripts instead of employees in a number of these roles, such as main battle tank crew, ordinary riflemen, squad corporal roles, and weapon systems on our Navy vessels. So since the birth of the Norwegian Constitution in 1814, all male citizens between 1944 have been subject to conscription. Provisions and further application of conscription is elaborated in Norwegian defense law. The Norwegian Parliament amended the law in 2014 to extend mandatory conscription to all citizens. giving men and women equal rights and obligations when it comes to protecting their country's interests, values, and territory. The first female conscripts were called to mandatory service in 2016. Women in the Norwegian Armed Forces have a long history of service. Women gained access to military service before the Second World War in 1985, all gender-based restrictions for positions were lifted, including for combat positions. Before 2016, with female volunteer conscripts only, women made up only 16% of all conscripts, while in 2024, the rate is now around 32%. I find it important to emphasize that universal conscription is not merely a diversity and inclusion measure. It widens the basis for talent search. With such a small population, Norway cannot afford to recruit from only 50% of the population. The armed forces need the most motivated and the best skilled people for filling a wide variety of jobs. In addition, our experience from international operations is that gender is both an asset and a force multiplier. And we find that the armed forces organizational culture benefits from more diversity. Skills, values, as well as mental and physical fitness are deciding factors when choosing candidates for positions in our combat units. And all conscripts are subject to the same tests during selection. And in 2024, Her Royal Highness Princess Ingrid Alexandra served as an engineer soldier and had a position as a gunner on a CV-90 Sting vehicle. The princess was dismissed in April this year after completing 15 months of service. And this is to illustrate sort of the universality of the Norwegian conscription system. I hear that the princess is heading to Australia next to start her university education, and I hope that she will inspire and share her experience with her fellow students. Universal conscription strengthens the legitimacy of the Norwegian armed forces. When asked, people generally agree that Norway should have conscription. Results from an official survey in 2024 concluded that about 79% of the population either fully agree or quite agree that Norway should have conscription. As you can see, the overall support in the population is high. There is also a yearly survey of conscripts in first-time service, and the conscripts themselves also report a high degree of satisfaction with service and would, for the most part, recommend military service to their peers. So, as I mentioned previously, every Norwegian citizen between ages 19 and 44 is technically subject to conscription. However, normally only persons who have completed basic training and first-time service are called to serve as reservists. We call this the active reserve, and the emphasis on active implies that the reserves are called into refresher training with some regularity. As illustrated in this slide, the Norwegian force structure relies heavily on reservists. The active reserve is mainly manned based on mandatory conscription, and this puts a considerable amount of people at the armed forces' disposal. However, there are limits to conscription that is clearly stated in Norwegian defense law. Some of these limits state that the duration of peacetime service cannot exceed 19 months in total during peacetime, and that the upper age limit to call on a person to complete basic training and first-time service is 28 years of age. It's therefore important to have several options and ways to make people and competence more readily available to the armed forces. In addition to the mandatory conscription, some reservists on contract are also needed to ensure inflow of necessary competence. The armed forces keep a data register of all conscripts, also of those who were never called to serve, where the armed forces gather and register information about employment and education, among other things. Using this register data, the armed forces can systematically identify the right persons for the right positions in the force structure and assign these persons to a specific role. If there are legal limitations on the use of conscription, the armed forces can offer a reservist contract. Entering such a contract with the armed forces is voluntary, of course, and it implies serving under the same terms as regular conscripts, though a bonus can in some cases be available. Contract-based reservist service is a means by which the armed forces can secure a more predictable inflow of competence. Many people in today's society reach the peak of their careers in their 40s, while also being physically fit for service. This group is a significant and valuable resource to the armed forces. Having passed the age limit for mandatory conscription, some of these people would still like to put their competence at the disposal of the armed forces, but without enlisting for a full or a part-time career. For the last part of my presentation, I will focus on another strategic initiative from the long-term plan that will address the need for more civilian-military cooperation on competence. A strategic plan for acquiring personnel within selected areas of expertise. The selected areas are technological expertise and technical expertise associated with the capabilities and systems that are critical to ensure military readiness. The strategy will seek to clarify which types of expertise that should be the sole responsibility of the military education system, as opposed to knowledge, skills, and competencies that are in demand in the armed forces but developed by the civilian educational system. We seek to address knowledge, skills, and competencies along the entire lifespan of the technology, starting from procurement of a given technology to the ability to use it, the capacity to maintain the different systems, and in the end, the capacity to further innovate concrete technologies or the way it is used in a military setting. For example, we need pilots to pilot combat aircrafts, technicians to maintain them, and the understanding of how the aircraft system can be utilized to enhance operational effectiveness in a combat situation. Many of these types of knowledges, skills, and competencies are in demand in society at large. As a consequence, the defense sector is competing both internally and with other actors in the civilian labor market for personnel. Dialogue and cooperation between the defense sector and civilian sectors are therefore needed to address the armed forces' demand for expertise. This includes exploring how we can facilitate collaboration with civilian organizations to secure access to scarce labor and competencies, and how competence, knowledge, and skills can be acquired through other forms of cooperation with civilian society, international partners, and businesses. The ambition is to publish this strategy by the end of 2025. So these were some of the highlights of the recruitment and retention measures in the Norwegian long-term plan for defense. And though not all of these measures are equally applicable in every country, I believe most of you have at least seen and heard some of the things that are familiar and maybe some new ideas. And if there's still time, I can take some questions now. Otherwise, you can save them for my colleague Eric later today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, we have time for two quick questions. Can you please grab the microphone and turn around and speak to the camera if you've got a question in relation to the wonderful presentation that we've just heard.
Hi, Camilla. My name's Rob Calhoun. Thank you for your presentation. I just had a question about your assessment of the strategy, but also you might impart to the audience how the total defense concept in countries like Norway, Sweden, Finland contribute to resilience as well. I think that ties into what you described with the better use of conscription. Specifically, the question I wanted to ask, though, is around the skilling that you talked about and how you would rationalize that to perhaps use conscripts in a way that they haven't been used previously, if I understood it correctly, in roles they might not have traditionally been used in. From an Australian perspective, we bias, I think, a lot of our training toward the full-time force, and whether or not the approach to skilling seeks to bring more people in to defence at a level of competence through the conscription period, and how that contributes to the, I guess, resilience of the force.
Yes, thank you very much for your question. When it comes to the competency of conscripts, I would like to underline that this is as you said, we're moving back to how it was a couple of decades ago. The roles that we see that are now being manned by employees that will in the future be manned by conscripts are mostly in the army. For now, we see that the army is sort of first among the services to implement this line of thinking. In the Air Force and the Navy, the resistance is a bit bigger to this kind of thinking, but this is also due to sort of the weapon systems that are being used in the other branches. Such education of conscripts is, of course, it demands a lot of resources, and the conscription system is by no means a free lunch. So we invest a lot in giving our conscripts such a comprehensive education through their first-time service. Our experience is that giving the conscripts a meaningful service and a proper job in the force structure while they are with us increases retention. So after completing their first-time service, all conscripts get the possibility to apply for a job in the armed forces, and they can apply for the job that they had during conscription. For the conscripts who serve in sort of lower competency positions during their first-time service, the retention is lower. So I believe that this is also sort of a measure by which we fill up the competence needs of the armed forces, but we also improve motivation and dedication among our conscripts. When it comes to the willingness to serve in the population in general, giving conscripts a meaningful job and a purpose while they are with us is, of course, it contributes to the attractiveness of the conscription system. I would like to underline that conscription isn't voluntary. So if you are called upon to serve, you have to serve. But we see that having the possibility to do something fun means that our 18-year-olds, a lot of them actually put in a lot of effort in order to secure that they will be selected for first-time service. They come prepared to selection. They have read up on the different kinds of services that they can take part in. They express concrete wishes to serve in a certain place or in a certain unit, and they have taken measures to increase their performance on the physical tests. So I don't know if that answered the totality of your question, but yes.
Thank you very much. One last question? Any other last questions? Well, Camilla, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I must say I was somewhat taken by the requirement in your constitution and the expectation on citizens to serve in their military forces. And while in Australia we don't have such a provision and we've got a dreadful reputation for changing our constitution, nevertheless I'm sure General Fox will take that on board and take it back to our political masters as a possible solution. But on behalf of the attendees here today at this international dialogue, I'd like to thank you particularly for your wonderful exposition of what Norway is doing in relation to the challenges that it faces in relation to recruitment and retention, and particularly when you've got significant strategic threats on your border. So thank you very much, and thank you for the time in the preparation and coming on board so early in the morning. We do appreciate it. Thank you very much.